Hello and welcome to Standard 13. So the Progressive Era is a time period in U.S. history that's focused on things like social justice and restraining big business and the rights of the workers and voters and minority groups and things like that. So with all of these people that we talk about, you can kind of relate at least their tenets, their core tenets, to some stuff we have going on today. We've seen a lot of protests, social protests in places like Charlottesville and things like that, that a lot of these types of reformers would probably agree with. So as we kind of move through this, just keep in mind that these things have a definite place far beyond just what we see back in the late 18 and early 1900s. So first, just a couple of terms and definitions so that we can use some common terminology moving forward. The Progressive Era, it refers to this whole period of social and political reforms where we're kind of trying to advocate for the little guy. During this time period, it becomes sort of commonplace to accept the idea that the government is going to be larger, that it's going to regulate or legislate in order to try to control society and make it a more fair playing ground. These reformers, they're known as progressives. So if you hear, these muckrakers like Upton Sinclair and Ida Tarbell, and we'll get to them here in a second, but they're known as progressives because they're reformers. So you kind of heard me just mention the first two muckrakers that we're going to look at. So firstly, the term comes from muckraker, which is really a raker of nasty muck and kind of the dirty parts of society. This is a muckraking political cartoon. That's Teddy Roosevelt, and he's breaking up or investigating. I don't know if you can read it on the rake right there, but he's investigating the meat scandal. We're going to get to that here in just 1 second. So first of all, Upton Sinclair, he is a journalist. He writes The Jungle, which is a book that's published in 1906, and it's kind of an expose on the Chicago meatpacking plant. Now, the practices that are going on in Chicago are what we would call today totally unacceptable. The health department would put the kibosh on this almost immediately. But what you see in Chicago at the time is conditions that are very unsanitary, things like, and they're very unsafe as well. So things like open bladed meat grinders where people would get their fingers cut off in these blades, and rather than stopping the production line and disposing of that batch of meat, they would just keep the grinder going, grind up the fingers, put it in the ground beef, and send that ground beef out to the stores. It was all about corporate profit because there was no legislation to restrain them. So Upton Sinclair, when he kind of exposes all of this kind of nasty practice in business, it leads to the Meat Inspection Act. This does things like establish the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, which is going to go through and regulate not just the meat industry, but also what we know of the FDA does today. It regulates the drug industry and things like that and makes sure that our products are safe to consume. Ida Tarbell, second muckraker. She is also an author. She writes a series of articles that are published that expose John Rockefeller and kind of the way that he builds his monopoly. So her articles together are called A History of the Standard Oil Company, published a little bit after, her last article is published a little bit after Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Not very much, but a little bit. The articles are based around, like I said, John Rockefeller, and it exposes him as being a very unethical man, very cutthroat businessman, and this is motivated from Ida Tarbell's perspective by the fact that her father's oil business in Pennsylvania is basically destroyed by John Rockefeller. He comes in and offers to buy Ida Tarbell's father's oil business, refining business. Ida Tarbell's dad says no, he refuses to sell to him. So John Rockefeller does what he does best. He prices his Standard Oil well below what Ida Tarbell's father could sell his oil for. I guess it's technically kerosene. But markets his product well below the competitive price for that kerosene. So everyone's going to buy Standard Oil. No one is going to buy Tarbell's father's kerosene until he goes out of business, and then John Rockefeller swoops in and buys up his company anyway at a much reduced price. So what Ida Tarbell's doing is basically marketing John Rockefeller in the court of public opinion as a cutthroat businessman, kind of absent of morals, doesn't really care about the impact of what he does as long as he wins in the business world. So those are our first two muckrakers. Jacob Riis is going to be our third. Jacob Riis is different from Ida Tarbell or Upton Sinclair because he doesn't write anything. He is a photojournalist. He takes pictures in order to tell a story. His compilation, his kind of crowning work, is called How the Other Half Lives. It's published before the turn of the century, 1890. What he does is go into these very crowded tenements. Now, tenements are just like slums, basically, slum apartment complexes. He goes in there and he takes photographs of how all these people live. So you can kind of see an example here. You've got 8 to 10 people living in this size apartment, which is unbelievably cramped and crowded. The reason that people do this is because they need to split the rent. They're not making hardly any money working in their factory jobs. There's no minimum wage laws, there's no safety conditions, things like that. So in order to survive, they have to cram themselves into these apartments to have a place to stay. So Jacob Riis goes in and he kind of exposes the unsafe nature of these tenements. There's no fire escapes. There's no indoor plumbing. So if you think about it, you've got all of these people crammed into these apartment buildings. All of them have to go to the restroom. If there's no indoor plumbing, you're using a chamber pot and throwing it out the window. Pretty nasty conditions. If there's a fire, there's no fire escapes. There's no emergency access. Stairwell gets blocked, you're going to die. That's the way it goes. So when Jacob Riis kind of illustrates all of this, the impact of what he does, our housing codes, sanitation departments, and then larger cities start to construct underground sewer systems that allow central plumbing to be run into these larger apartment buildings, buildings with larger occupancies, in order to lower the occurrence of disease and ultimately just make the city a healthier place to be. Okay. So all of these muckrakers combined, if you look at Upton Sinclair, you look at Ida Tarbell and Jacob Riis, and you take them collectively. I mentioned before how this era leads to a larger government and more kind of belief that the government needs to regulate society in order to avoid that society harming itself. That's really the overall impact of these muckrakers. And if you remember nothing else, this is what you really need to get. The idea that the government's going to grow and the government is going to increase its presence in society through legislation during this time period.